Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 18th of July. Today we're going to be talking about the explosions that occurred on the Crimean Bridge. We're going to be talking about the grain deal. We're going to be talking about the Russian offensive activity on the Zaporizhia front. Let's get into this because there's a lot of news that needs to be discussed. Starting off with what occurred on the Kerch Bridge. This is the time of year where you have a lot of Russian civilians that are making their way across the bridge to go to summer resorts in Crimea. It's a very popular tourist attraction from Russia proper. So on July 16th, around 3 a.m., we had these two explosions that were reported, and they occurred really under the 145th pier of the Southern Road Bridge, which would be the one over here. I'm going to mark it for you guys so you could know what I'm talking about specifically. And it happened around the area where I have the blue marker placed under it. And so what occurred was you had these two explosions, and as a result, the bridge segment, which was directly under the explosion, it had a massive damage. What happened most likely is that the blast was so strong that the bridge segment separated from the pier right under it that was holding it up. And so now the situation is that that bridge segment is sort of dangling and it's tilted down under, so the entire structure is faulty in that area and has to be replaced for the Russians to, set it up again and have traffic running through. And so it did not fall into the water from what we've seen, and the road deck was not damaged substantially either. In terms of the damage, most of it occurred to the underside of the bridge and to the wiring tray under the bridge. There was also damage to the northernmost bridge, especially to the first lane, where it does seem like there was a bit of a dislocation. I'll show the overhead image of that so you can get an idea of the full extent of the damage to the northernmost bridge. But that bridge will take less time to be fully repaired in comparison to the southern one. Now, the rail bridge, which is probably the most important bridge out of all of these three, because that's where Russia moves most of its heavy equipment through to reach Zaporizhia, that one is not damaged from what we've seen. There's videos of people within these, these trains as they're passing by the damage, and they're recording it, which already indicates to us that the Russians have opened up rail traffic again. There may be some scheduling issues, but besides that, there's not much of an issue that's occurred here. And the entire reason why striking this bridge is so important is because this is really the one artery that the Russians have, and from there you enter Crimea, and then from there you enter into Zaporizhia, Kherson, these key parts of the front line. And so in terms of, disrupting this logistical situation for the Russians, you can't really do that if the rail bridge is still standing. But I will say that certainly there will be Russian logistical issues due to the fact that the two road bridges have been damaged. One of them basically destroyed in one area, and so it's going to take months to repair that. In terms of how long it will take specifically, what I've seen from the Russians is that they've already opened up one lane of traffic going in the reverse way. And so this is the lane that I'm talking about. It's the northernmost lane of the northernmost bridge. And so the traffic has been opened up, but it's for Russian civilians that are going on cars back to Russia proper, to Taman. In terms of when the entire northern bridge will open, and it will go both ways, the Russians are hoping to do that by September 15th. And then for the southern bridge, the one that experienced the most damage, which I'll show in photos, that's around November. So until then, the Russians will have less of a volume of equipment being moved across the bridge directly. So that will make it harder for resupplies to reach the front line, especially with the Kherson counteroffensive ongoing. There's other ways of getting supplies to the front line. Obviously, the rail bridge, you have ferries that are going across this entire Taman Bay and Kerch Strait. You also have the land bridge between Russia proper and Crimea, which has Donetsk and has Zaporizhia. And I do have a map of the different rail lines that run through here. And there's also the highways that Google Maps marks in yellow for everybody. So it's not like this is the end of the world for the Russians. They will be able to recover from it faster than the first strike, which had more damage, probably because it was a truck bomb that was directly on the road deck. But this is still, it did still cause damage, obviously, including civilian casualties. 2 dead, 1 injured, as I said before. And we're now looking at Russia's response. So Putin, he organized his entire cabinet and they had an emergency meeting. And what they talked about was taking different measures to strengthen the security of the bridge, because even though this time the attack did not occur on land on the road deck itself, the Ukrainians were still able to send, and this is still unconfirmed, but I think this is the most likely explanation, that they sent this underwater drone all the way to the bridge. And how did they do that? Because look, maybe it was launched from Odessa, maybe from Kyiv. Look at the distances from there to the bridge. That's like 400 miles. So how did it go underwater for that long? And some of the drones that I've seen thrown around, they have like a depth of 600 meters. So how did it go underwater for 600 meters for so long, 400 miles, that it reached the bridge without being detected at all by the Russian forces? Stop. So that's a question to be asked. There's also a question to be asked about whether it was launched from land. Perhaps it was launched from a certain vessel that the Ukrainians were utilizing. And maybe that vessel was going through the grain deal corridor. We don't know that for sure, but I'm just throwing out potential scenarios. We also know that the Russians did halt the grain deal. They did leave the agreements, which was between the Ukrainians, the Turkish, and the Russians. And what that did is that it allowed these different civilian grain ships to pass through different safe corridors to the rest of the world, especially to Europe, but also to Africa, Middle East, Asia. And that was very important for supplying the entire world with grain. This is generally where the corridor went through. Maybe I'm wrong about the specifics, but it looks something like this, making its way further to the south through the Black Sea. And what this did is that it hindered Russia's ability to send the Black Sea fleet very close to Ukraine's coast. And this made it difficult for basically making the Black Sea fleet and its vessels a platform for Russia to launch missiles and to launch drones and to fire onto the coast. And so that did help Ukraine's security in Odessa and Mykolaiv, but now the Russians have withdrawn. They actually withdrew hours after the explosions on the Crimean Bridge. But from what I've seen from Russian spokespeople, they're saying that it has nothing to do with the Crimean Bridge explosion, and it's for other reasons due to agreements relating to Russian fertilizer trade. But I don't know, maybe it was something that was being planned in the making, and then it just so happened to coincide with the Ukrainian Crimean Bridge explosion. Either way, the timing is pretty interesting. It does mean that the Russians will now not be under any sort of obligation to protect Ukrainian vessels that are passing through the Black Sea, because there's always a threat that perhaps the Ukrainians were shipping and funneling different weaponry through the grain corridor. That can't be confirmed, obviously, but now the Russians will be able to do whatever they want to those vessels, unless Turkey does, in some sort of capacity, try to defend those grain vessels that are moving the equipment and supplies through past Istanbul. So going back to the drone that was utilized, I've seen some claim, and again unconfirmed, that a British Zherebets 600 autonomous underwater drone was utilized and that it was controlled by a laptop. But I don't know if this is true. I think that a more likely drone that would have been utilized is the second generation variant of the Ukrainian underwater vessel and that drone, which potentially held 1,000 pounds, which is 453 kilograms of explosives, which is why it was able to cause the damage that it did. But then again, I am still wondering, how did it travel so far all the way to that bridge without being spotted? So that's really an unanswered question. It appears that as of the recording of this video, which is, you know, nearly July 18th in Eastern Time, that the Russians have started the retaliation for the Ukrainian strike on the bridge. What we're hearing is that there are Geron 2 explosions that have occurred in Odessa, specifically on different types of oil depots. There was also an explosion at an oil depot at the Mykolaiv ports, which is over here, somewhere around here. We don't know specifically the geolocation, but there was a strike over there, and there was a large fire that was reported. There was also an incident earlier, a few hours ago, of a Ukrainian air defense missile which tried intercepting these Russian drones, but failed, and the missile actually just launched and back to the ground, causing some damage over there, which is unknown. There are not many videos of the drones themselves exploding, but there is a lot of video of audios of what occurred. And from what we heard, there are a lot of explosions that sound like the Drone 2 hit its target. There were three that I listened to in the Odessa area. So that could indicate that the Russians are ramping up their attacks on Odessa, Mykolaiv, other big cities around the Black Sea coast due to the Ukrainian actions. And after the first Ukrainian strike, if you recall, that caused the Russians to go on their own sort of really wave, and not just one wave, but over a dozen waves of strikes, airstrikes, drone strikes, all across Ukraine, targeting energy infrastructure, but mainly targeting the substations. There was some targeting of power plants, obviously, but it was mainly on the transformers within the substations, not on the power plants themselves. And so that temporarily caused a basically damaging to 30% of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, but they were able to fix it for the most part. And I would say that now the Ukrainian energy grid is pretty stable. We're going to have to see if Russia begins to launch strikes again at it. And maybe this time they'll focus more on power plants and on substations. I don't know if that's true, but we'll have to see if that's Russian retaliation, because already a few hours after the strike on the Crimean Bridge, we're already seeing the Russian retaliation, which does include really large waves of drones being used, probably for the first time in a couple of weeks from what I've seen since June. So now let's go on to the situation on the front line, because we've been talking a lot about the Crimean Bridge explosion, but there is still obviously stuff going on the front line. Let's begin by looking at Zaporizhia, where the Ukrainians are beginning to move reinforcements around the Pyaty sector, specifically from the 118th Mechanized Brigade, one of the newer units that was formed in lieu of the counteroffensive, which is now started. Let me see if this is actually that unit. Yeah, 118th Mechanized Brigade, and also the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, in order to fortify Pyaty and begin launching further attacks towards the Zherebets. But no frontline changes over there. Now, Robotyne, this is very interesting. Before I get into the front lines, I want to talk about how the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which is one of the main units involved in attacking towards Robotyne, has received some reinforcements as they continue to launch their attacks towards Robotyne and on some of the nearby fields. Now, into Robotyne itself, the interesting thing about the situation is that I was under the belief that the Russians were no longer in control of any portions of the Bakhmut nature reserve, which, is generally over here. I don't know exactly, but generally in that perimeter. But from what I've been seeing from a Ukrainian video, which was geolocated to this marker over here, the Ukrainians hit Russian positions which were within that nature reserve, which does indicate that the Russians at some point in time over the past few days have been able to attack, basically launch a counterattack and retake some of the Ukrainian lost positions that they had lost to the Ukrainians a week or two ago in this region. So what I'm thinking is going on over here is that the area where Russia's attacking now, which I'll mark over here, this is the area where they made some gains in, this perimeter. It's a pretty small area. In terms of the measurements of what they took, it would look like 1.5 miles, basically. That area is located on a minor ridge. So there is a certain high ground aspect to the vector where Russia is attacking through. And then the Ukrainians, the area where they're trying to attack is also sort of on a ridge. The area where the Ukrainians are trying to attack is some of the areas that are either directly to the north of Robotyne or a bit to the northeast of Robotyne. So generally in this direction. And so the Ukrainians are trying to get control of this high ground because Robotyne is on a bit of a ridge in comparison to the local fields which are on a valley. And then the Russians are also trying to get control of the heights in this area. And then the area that no side wants to have significant positions in are these fields in between, the ones over here, which include parts of Bakhmut and also certain trench systems. So the Russians are trying to fortify their positions on the heights in order to fire onto the Ukrainian forces that are located within that valley. And then the Ukrainians are trying to do the same thing by securing Robotyne. So that's generally the situation over here. I did adjust the front line to actually give Russia more land than they previously had, but that's about it. Now moving on to the situation around Pryutne. Here the situation is pretty interesting. We have seen some satellite imagery which confirms that there has been significant shelling by the Russians of the area just to the north of Pryutne. Not in Pryutne itself, but in an area just to the north of it, which includes several fields and local allotments. So I'll mark that area over here. What this indicates is that Ukraine did send a forward group to attack in that direction. Obviously, they don't have a solid control over this area because it is so close to the Russian fortifications in Prudne. But it does mean that the front line has shifted very close to the town itself, because the Ukrainian line that I had previously thought of was around this, entire river line with all these different ponds. And so, if the Ukrainians were able to push towards the northern outskirts of Prudne, that would be like 2.25 miles. So that is a significant advance, and it has been occurring over the past few days. And we've also seen a lot of marks of shelling within these open fields in some of the areas that are adjacent to this valley, which leads up into Prudne. So there's a valley over here, I'm marking it with these red lines, which leads into Prudne. There's different ponds in it, in that valley area, that low elevated area, and there's also different bush lines that are running through it. And so you can see that with the development of the shelling over the past few days in this area, there has been an increase in presumably Russian shelling onto Ukrainian positions, and it gets nearer and nearer to Prudne over time. And now we're seeing the shelling occurring in some allotments just to the north of it, which does mean that Ukraine is planning to attack the town itself very soon. In Staromayorsk, there are reports, and these are unconfirmed. I've seen them from mainly Ukrainian sources, but I've also seen some less reliable Russian sources mention that Staromayorsk is now contested by the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians have positions within the town, specifically in the northwestern part of the town over here. I can't confirm that, so I'm not gonna change the map, but just keep an eye out if that turns out to be the case. Going a bit to the north, the clashes around Klishivka continue, no changes over there. Burkivka, there was an attempted Ukrainian counterattack trying to take over the Russian positions, which they took over in their counterattack, which occurred a few days ago. I have a video on it. And that area that the Russians took over is generally over here in terms of distance. That is about, let's see, about 1 mile, perhaps. So the Ukrainians were trying to take back that area and perhaps reach Burkivka itself, but the 98th Guards Airborne Division and its artillery was able to push back the Ukrainians, and they suffered, I believe, 2 vehicle losses in that assault. So for now, the front line remains the same in that area. Now, going a bit to the north to the Zaporizhia line, I do want to focus a lot on this area. First, we're going to focus on the front line, and then we're going to go into talks about a general Russian offensive. So, first, Torske. In that area, the Russians are now on a defensive footing. Originally, they were attacking towards Torske and Polivka, but now Ukraine is sending small groups to probe the Russian line. So, for now, we've seen a decrease in Russian offensive activity on this part of the front line compared to a week ago. A bit to the north, we have reports that the Russians were able to dislodge the Ukrainians from one of their strong points in the northeasternmost point of the Zherebets beam, which is a low elevated valley, but there are some adjacent hedgerows that are running through that area. So they took over one strong point from the 1st Special Purpose Brigade of the Ukrainian forces, which is located over here. Going even further to the north, the Russians did cross the Zherebets River at a certain area. Here's the Zherebets River, if you are unaware, over here. And the Russians, they were able to advance, let's look at the distances for this, about 1.4 miles towards the westward direction, taking over open fields and taking over different forested areas. So the unit that was able to do this is the 21st Motor Rifle Brigade, and that brigade is located over here. In this Russian attack, which has been successful so far in advancing, crossing the river for the first time in a while for the Russian forces, nearly reaching the border between Kharkiv and Luhansk Oblast, that offensive is being met with Ukrainian reinforcements. The Ukrainians are moving in reinforcements from the 25th Airborne Brigade, and they're trying to stop further Russian breakthroughs. They're also sending in artillery. They're launching artillery strikes from a battery in Makivka, which includes M777 howitzers. So we're going to have to see if Russia continues advancing in this area or if the breakthrough is quelled. Now, going a bit to the north, I am seeing a new round of rumors from the pro-Russia side about the status of Novoselivsk. I've seen some of the smaller channels say that it is fully under Russian control. But this could potentially be a misunderstanding because I've seen Rybar, for instance, they are saying that it's no more Ukrainian fortified positions, of course, but that it is still a gray zone and the Russians have not fully cleared it. And so those smaller channels might have misinterpreted that as being Russia taking it over in its entirety, which is not the case. This is generally what the front line looks like. Not all of Novosibirsk has been cleared out just yet. Now, in terms of the entire Zvatovil line, there is a lot to talk about over here because we had an announcement from specifically the Eastern Military Command spokesperson of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. And what he's saying is that in the Lyman-Kupyansk direction, and Liman is over here, you can't see it on the map really, and then Kupyansk is over here. These are two major cities that Ukraine took back in its first counteroffensive, Kharkiv counteroffensive, and now the Russians are eyeing it, apparently. What the Ukrainians are saying is that the Russians have more than 100,000 personnel in this entire sector, including over 900 tanks, 555 artillery systems, and 370 MLRS systems. This is a Ukrainian report, by the way. And the Ukrainians are also reporting the Russians are launching offensive activities in the direction of Kupyansk. And I hate when people say, offensive activities in a general direction without giving a specific town that's being attacked or a specific direction, specifically not Kupyansk direction, because Kupyansk direction is so broad. Look at Kupyansk. Kupyansk is at best 3 miles, 2 miles away from the front line. So from where is it being attacked? Is it being attacked from Sinkivka? Like, are the Russians attacking Sinkivka and then from there attacking Kupyansk? Or are they attacking from Vilchana? Like, it's too broad to just say attack towards Kupyansk. You have to be specific about the direction from which it's coming in. But anyway, let's take an in-depth look into the Russian troop concentrations in this area. So I have a tweet that I wrote out earlier today. And what I'm saying here is that the Ukrainian number of over 100,000 troop personnel for the Russian forces actively going on the offensive in the Lyman-Kupyansk direction is a bit of an exaggeration. Just for starters, a pro-Russian site, RV they're saying that the Russians have about 60,000 active personnel in the Lyman direction. Now, you don't have to trust them, but I'm just going to go with what they say for a little bit because they have very detailed information in this specific piece of information. But what they're saying here is that in the Lyman direction, and this is not including Kupyansk, did not explicitly mention Kupyansk direction. So I don't know if the accumulations that RV Voronkoy is talking about in the following information is including Kupyansk or not, but whatever. They're saying that there's 60,000 active personnel. And that's not including reserves. Reserves, if they were to be included, those would include 2 motorized rifle regiments, 2 territorial defense regiments, and 2 reserve regiments that are currently undergoing combat training. And then each regiment should have about 900 to 2,000 men, depending on whether it's at full strength, which I don't know. And then that would mean when you add up all the numbers that there's about 5,400 to 12,000 reserve, which would be best case scenario, 72,000 people across the entire line. Now, RV Voronkoy, they also mentioned the types of units that the Russian force is composed of in this area. They're saying 8 separate motorized rifle brigades. They're saying 16 motorized rifle, tank, and air assault regiments. They're saying 9 territorial defense motorized rifle regiments. They're saying 1 separate tank battalion, 2 territorial defense separate motorized rifle battalions, 8 volunteer and bars units, and then artillery, 1 missile brigade, 2 artillery brigades, and 4 self-propelled artillery regiments, and 1 artillery regiment. And the artillery brigades, I don't have a specific number for the amount of personnel in those units. But I do know generally the estimates for the amount of Russian forces within each of the other units within the army. And the ranges are extremely, extremely broad. Look at this. For a brigade, it's 2 to 8,000 men each. So that leaves a massive amount of leeway for there to be a lot of Russian men in a certain brigade or very small amounts. But when you do the math about these numbers provided by RV Voronkoy, you can see that the best case scenario for Russian troop concentrations would be about 112,600 men. in addition to the men from the artillery units. But I do think that this is unlikely because it would assume that every single Russian unit is at full strength. And the Ukrainians, they were saying 100,000, so this would be even more than the 100,000 number by 12,000. In terms of a worst case scenario, that would be 37,200 plus the men and the artillery. That's also, I believe, pretty unlikely, given the fact that we've seen much higher numbers from all sides in terms of the amount of men. And if you doubt the numbers from RV Voronkry, that's fine. I don't trust them fully either. But what I'll say is that if you look on my map and the units that I have mapped over here, you could count them for yourself. You'll see that the amount of regiments, the amount of brigades, and I'm talking here specifically about motorized infantry, not about artillery. When you count the infantry units, you'll see that they're pretty similar on my map to the numbers that are provided by RV Voronkry. Obviously, there is a bit of room for leeway because my map is not perfect. There's a lot of things that I may be omitting out of ignorance, or I may have outdated information. So some of the units might be placed in Zaporizhia when maybe they're not even there anymore. But look at what I have over here. I counted 10 regiments, motorized ref regiments that are on the Zaporizhia sector. And then RV Voronkry, they say 13. And I counted 11 brigades and they say 8. So it is still pretty similar. So perhaps the number of 60, 70,000 would make sense. It is also between the best case scenario of 112,000 and the worst case scenario of 37,000. So then in this case, the 100,000 number would be more of an exaggeration. Regardless of that, there is still a possibility that the Ukrainians are correct in their suspicion that the Russians are attacking and going on the offensive. But this is not a new thing. The Russians have been attacking this direction really for about a month, I would say, and they've been ramping up their offensive activity progressively. We've looked at Russian attacks towards Kupyansk really in a video from a month ago, and I was talking about how they were able to advance about a mile. We've also talked last week, I believe, about these Russian gains in the direction of Torsk. And so the statement of a Russian offensive doesn't mean that it started now. It's just an official Ukrainian acknowledgement of the reality on the front lines. So that's all I have for today. This was a bit of a long one. Sorry for that. Well, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.